Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Clark. I work with Gender Spectrum, and I'm going to be your host for today's Google Hangout. I'm joined by four colleagues from four different organizations that collaborated on creating this document. So the team is going to spend a few moments kind of introducing themselves and introducing the document, and then we're going to shift to a Q&A about the document itself. So we're going to talk about how to use it and answer any questions that you have. Now, there's a Q&A part of this Hangout that you'll be able to type questions into the chat feature. To access that, click on the cluster of squares that are going to appear. It should be at the top of your screen, probably right up about there. And so you'll be able to go to the Q&A on that page. When you click on that, you'll be able to go back and forth between the Q&A function and the showcase itself. In the showcase, that has a link to the document in case that is helpful. We're in the Q&A. When you are in the Q&A, if somebody asks a question and you think, that's a great question, I also have that question, hit that +1 button, and that's a way for us to know that other folks also have that question. If for any reason you start having technical difficulties during the Hangout, we recommend that you clear out of all of your other programs on your computer or reduce the number of kind of internet browser tabs you have open. If you have an office mate or a child who's in another room who's streaming music on your connection, ask them to turn that off, as anything that's taking up bandwidth on your router or running memory on your computer should be closed out. If for any reason one of the five of us has technical difficulties on our end, please be patient. Even though it says live, there is about a 30-second delay. So if we have any technical issues, it will take us just a little bit to know that that is happening. So with all that said, thank you so much for being a part of this Hangout, and I'm going to hand things over to Asaf Orr, staff attorney at the National Center for Lesbian Rights.
Hi, everybody. My name is Asaf. Thank you, Justin. And I am Transgender Youth Project staff attorney at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And I'm one of the lead authors on Schools in Transition.
Hi, everyone. My name's Joel Baum, and I'm Senior Director for Professional Development and Family Support Services at Gender Spectrum. I'm the other lead author for the Schools in Transition Guide, and my preferred gender pronouns are he, him, and his.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Eager, and I use she, her, and hers pronouns. And I am the Director of Welcoming Schools, which is a project of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation's programs. And I'm really excited to be here with you today.
And my name is Chris Hampton. I work at the American Civil Liberties Union's LGBT project as a youth and program strategist. That is a mouthful. And my PGPs are she, her, hers.
Great, thanks everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started by just telling you briefly about the background around the development of the guide. And tell you a little bit about the principles that actually informed its creation. The four organizations which were involved in developing this guide spent almost a year in ongoing conversation in developing these materials. They're grounded in both the best practices of each of the organizations that they've utilized in supporting transgender students at schools, as well as much of the research in the field, and also lessons learned from many of the amazing school communities with whom we've worked in creating those conditions. In addition to those experiences, there were several really important principles that the four organizations spent quite a bit of time discussing as the foundation for this document. Those principles can actually be found in the introduction to the guide on page 3, and I'm going to briefly share those with you now because it's important that those principles inform your use of the guide. And the first is that every student, of course, has a right to learn in a safe and accepting school environment, and that feeling safe at school is critical for a student to be successful there. We also recognize that all adults must take responsibility for the health and well-being of the students they're privileged to work with. That doesn't just mean the educators, but all the adults that work directly with that child. Another important principle within that is the idea that rather than a guide directed to educators to respond to the concerns of families, or a guide directed towards families for dealing, quote unquote, with their schools, this guide assumes that all the adults in a student's life are committed to that student's success at school, and that they will be working as a team in order to support that student's success. Even as there are gaps in trust in some of these processes that come in really all directions, excuse me, and we recognize those, this assumes that everyone involved is operating from the most excuse me, positive place, and that they are working together to support that student. The guide also assumes that the expression of transgender identity is also a naturally occurring aspect of being a person, and that the gender diversity of young people is something to be supported and celebrated, and that any attempts or requests to force a child to behave or identify in a way not consistent with their sense of self is not only inappropriate, but actually unethical. Finally, we recognize that this is a learning process, that everyone in this experience is on a journey, and that as long as there is an assumption of positive intent and that everyone is working well and working towards a positive end, that people can be learners in this process. And that as long as there is that commitment to working together as a team and ongoing communication, that the outcomes will generally be positive for all involved. So as we work the rest of the hour together, please keep in mind those principles because they were essential in the development of this guide. Thanks, and I'm going to hand it over, I believe, to Joanna, who's going to talk a little bit about the organization of the document.
Yeah, so Chris and I are actually going to walk you through some of the highlights in each of the chapters in the document. So I'm going to start with the first three, and then Chris will be sharing with you the following chapters. So in highlighting chapter one in the guide provides information about basic concepts of gender that are critical to understanding and supporting a transgender or gender expansive child. The chapter shares information on misconceptions about gender and understanding the complexity of both gender and sex, as well as understanding the difference between a person's sexual orientation and gender identity, emphasizing, of course, that everyone has a gender identity and sexual orientation. The chapter moves on to a list of about 15 definitions relating to gender, including terms such as cisgender, gender identity, transition, and many more terms. And the chapter concludes with a section on how gender identity develops, sharing that children typically begin expressing their gender identity between the ages of 2 and 4 years old. Chapter 2 speaks to the importance of how supporting transgender youth and creating gender-inclusive learning environments in schools provides the opportunity for every child to thrive in schools. The chapter shares some information about the importance of meeting all students' needs and the responsibility that schools have to provide for those needs. And then the chapter shares information about the long-term effects on mental health and life satisfaction, not to mention the inability to focus on learning when students suffer from harassment and bullying related to their gender expression and or any part of their identity that's considered to be different. The chapter concludes by emphasizing once again that school is a place where all children should be exploring ideas and discovering new skills and not being limited based on others' perceptions of their gender. And really, the chapter overall makes the case that creating a safe and supporting learning environment is beneficial to all students, certainly to transgender and gender expansive students, but as importantly, it's important for all students. And then the final chapter that I'm going to talk to you about or highlight is Chapter 3. And Chapter 3 sets out general guidelines for meeting the needs of transgender students and making decisions about a student's transition. The chapter importantly emphasizes that there is no one universal correct way to create a transition plan, and that a student's age or personality, the level of family support, the school's organizational design, even the time of year can all affect how a transition plan might unfold. The chapter emphasizes a student's right to privacy and that the school community does not have the right to know about the student's gender transition, and very importantly introduces schools to obligations under FERPA, which is known as the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And then Chapter 3 concludes by describing the differences and the nuances that determine if a transition is going to be public or private. And in the case of a public transition, the chapter offers wonderful talking points to respond to questions or negative reactions that may come up from the school community that an administrator or teacher could just go directly to the document and use. And in the case of a private transition, the guide shares how to honor a private transition, as well as understanding how a private transition may be inadvertently compromised. So those are just some of the highlights from the first 3 chapters, and Chris, I'll turn it over to you for the following.
Thanks. I'm going to rip through this. So Chapter 4, Key Elements and Practical Tips. So that's getting into the nitty-gritty practical stuff in a trans student's daily life, like dress codes and names and pronouns and school record systems, roll call, sex-separated facilities and programs like prom royalty or locker rooms or overnight field trips, PE, sports teams, all that kind of stuff is discussed in this chapter. And there's also some tips on how to handle discrimination, bullying, and harassment. Chapter 5 is on complex issues, so that's everything that's tough. It's a lot of it is about what schools can do when parents or guardians are not on board, whether that's that they're just not there yet or they're actively unsupportive and don't want the school to do anything to acknowledge their child's trans identity. There's some information in this chapter on how special education law can be used to get some accommodations for trans students, because those laws are meant to help students who have difficulty in school, and it's not just physical or learning disabilities, which is I think what both folks usually think when they think about special ed law. It can be used to help students who are experiencing social and emotional struggles as well. So there are some ways to work that system to your advantage that we talk about in that chapter. And Chapter 6 is legal issues. It gets into the kind of stuff that we at the ACLU and other legal groups like NCLR work on, like the federal ban on sex discrimination in public schools, because if a student is treated badly because they don't conform to what people expect of their sex assigned at birth, the argument can be made that that's sex discrimination. The law that Joanna mentioned earlier about student records has implications for keeping a trans student's trans status private. There's also some boy, let me say that again. There's also information on how constitutional rights like free speech and equal protection come into play for trans students. This is an area of the law that's changing pretty rapidly. Federal courts are dealing with cases about restroom access right now, for example. So one other thing I just want to note is a lot depends on the details of your particular situation. This chapter should help you understand your rights better, but if you suspect that what's happening to you isn't legal, you should really get in touch with NCLR or us or one of the other legal organizations. That's all.
Thanks, Chris. And I will do a little bit of an overview on the appendices. You know, as we wrote this document, surprisingly, it was actually longer than it is now. But we decided there was some really important information that, for those of you who want to do a deeper dive into some of the issues that we talk about, we wanted to provide that information. So we decided to put it in the appendices. And there is some really great information in there. You know, for example, at the beginning, we talked, in Chapter 1, we talk about how gender identity develops. But in the appendices, we sort of follow that conversation up with a discussion of what transition looks like for a young person, both the social transition and also more focusing on the medical aspects of that transition if they decide to pursue those kind of treatments. You know, following up from there, we also, you know, as we talked about, although this guide focuses a lot on transgender students, we obviously wanted to raise up the experiences of gender expansive students. And there will be students who come into school who are going to to respect their gender identity, you need to use gender-neutral pronouns. We wanted to give folks a sense of what that looks like, what some options are, and how to actually use them in sentences because they're not sort of built into our daily language usage. In addition to that, one of the other sort of practical things that we wanted to include, which is in Appendix C, is how to respond to the many questions that schools get, that you might get if you're a parent out there, that your school might ask you. You know, for example, how do we deal with parent concerns about restroom access? How do we deal with sort of creating a more gender-inclusive environment and sort of response to that? Because there will be pushback. Some parents may disagree with sort of breaking down gender stereotypes in schools. You know, in Appendix D, we have 2 documents which can be incredibly helpful to you as a family or to the school in helping to think through all the issues that could come up during a student's transition. So that's your gender transition plan and your gender support plan. And lastly, to follow up on the special education piece, we wanted to also provide some additional information. It's not only that special education laws can be useful for transgender students, but we also wanted to make sure that those folks for whom that would apply, that you knew the sort of follow through, sort of making sure that the assessment process is gender affirming, as well as what goes into the IEP. And I think that rounds out for the description of our guide. And I think we're going to go to questions now, so I'm going to turn it back to Justin to talk about how to submit questions and what our process is going forward.
Great. So if you joined us late, there is a Q&A section that you can access. So if you click at the top part of your screen, so it should be something that looks like this. It's a collection of little squares, and you can click back and forth between the Q&A and what's called the showcase. So if you click on the Q&A button, you can type in your questions into that chat feature at the bottom. It says ask a new question, type it in, and then if you like a question that somebody else asks, click that +1 button, and that's how we know that multiple people have that question. So to get us started, I'm going to throw things back to Joel, and everyone as kind of as a group is going to be collectively answering the questions. I'm going to throw things back to Joel to ask to answer that first question. Joel?
Great, thank you, Justin. This first question is a really important one around the idea of differences between public and private transitions and why it's important to involve the student and, whenever possible, the student's caregivers in that process of deciding. When we talk about a public transition, or really any student transition, what we're really talking about is a moment in time in which a student, in fact, is declaring to their community, this is who I am, it's how I want to be known, it's how I want to be referred to. If there's a new name involved, if there's a use of pronouns or alternative pronouns, it's the opportunity to say to that community, here's what I'm asking. When that's done publicly, what it allows for, excuse me, is the ability for everyone involved to control the information that's being shared as compared to having that information control the individuals or the community. By having a public transition in this way, it allows the student to declare exactly what they are asking and what they're wanting to share with their community. It also allows them the opportunity to say what the limits are in terms of being approached or not approached, the degree to which they are open to talking about their gender, the degree to which they're not, the degree to which they are defining themselves as transgender or not. In other words, it's the opportunity to control that information. In terms of the decision and why it's important to include the family and child in that process, one of the things we want to emphasize and that the gender transition plan also emphasizes is the notion of trade-offs. One of my favorite sayings is that perfection is highly overrated, and the idea that there is an absolute correct way to make these decisions or an ideal solution in every case is not accurate and sets us up for failure. Instead, what's important in deciding whether transition's public or private is to really talk through the various trade-offs of the different approaches and to then assess the pros and cons of those trade-offs. And that'll be really different depending on the young person involved, the capacity of the school to respond to questions, their ability to handle anything that might come up, and most importantly, the comfort level of the child with their willingness to be public about the information and the degree to which they want to either deal or not deal with the questions or other issues that might arise within their community. So again, less than focusing on what the right answer is, it's the right answer for a particular child based on understanding those trade-offs.
So I'd like to just sort of chime in about some of the legal issues that come up with regards to public versus private transition. I think it's really important to keep in mind that regardless of what a family chooses or a young person chooses about their transition, that as a school district, you should really be holding that information as private. It is still a private process, and unless you get sort of explicit permission from the student or family to disclose that information, you really shouldn't be disclosing it to anyone at the school, particularly not other students or their families. Another thing, though, even if it is a private transition where they say, for example, a family comes in and says, look, we just want the principal to know, or maybe one or two teachers, that doesn't mean that the student can't discuss it with their peers. That's certainly something that they can discuss, and one of the reasons why we talk about in the guide that even if it's a private transition, you have to plan for it becoming a public transition, because you know, the student may become more comfortable and want to share this information with their peers, which is great. I mean, we want them to feel comfortable with their identity and to do that if that's what they want to do. So even if they choose to be private, you know, they can still talk about it. And I think those are some of the main legal issues that come up, regardless of whether it's a public or private transition, but around transitioning in general.
Thanks, Asaf. And I just want to add one clarification here, which is, of course, in many cases, students are coming to a school community and the opportunity is before them in which they really can establish that private transition. In some cases, though, in fact, in many cases, we have students who are already attending a school and while remaining in that community, seeking then to transition. And while those rights to privacy, Asaf mentioned, are absolutely there, what we try to coach families and schools to recognize is that if a student has been known, say, for 3 years as Joel, and now starting in 4th grade, that student wants to be known as Jennifer, that there are public aspects of that, whether the student wants there to be or not. In other words, my peers knew me as Joel, and now I'm asking them to know me as Jenny. And again, within the spirit of considering trade-offs, we have to recognize that there will very likely be questions, and most often very certainly unhurtful questions or wonderings by the peers about that transition. And so while the right to privacy absolutely exists, we also have to, I think, be thoughtful about the lived reality of that student who last year and for the last 3 years was known as Joel and now is asking to be referred to as Jenny. And in our experience, it's really important to be prepared for those questions that may be coming up from students, and as I said, being in front of those if at all possible. In some cases, the degree to which something is public or private is going to be based on the circumstances, and even in cases where there is a completely private transition, we also still have to prepare for someone to have that privacy compromised, either because the young person hopefully is feeling so great and safe at the school that perhaps at some point they share with a peer what their situation is, or perhaps someone who knew that child in another context, even in another community in this age of social media, may very well recognize that student from when they were living in their assigned gender. So I think, again, this notion of public and private has both these legal implications, which absolutely have to be respected, and schools need to be very careful in how they navigate those spaces. And at the same time, in working to support a family and young person around this, we have to be really realistic with them about what may end up unfolding when that transition is happening in a public domain. see a question here, and it says, can you talk a bit about why this is so important? Why is it critical to ensure that every young person is comfortable with themselves and affirmed? And I'll certainly take an initial shot at that, but I'm imagining my colleagues have some ideas as well. First and foremost, when a student is not affirmed in their sense of self when it comes to gender, we know from very clear research that there are significant short-term and long-term outcomes. The students' mental health and well-being, their sense of own safety on campus, their risk of becoming involved in high-risk activities such as drug use, the potential for self-harm are all greatly increased when a student does not feel affirmed in their authentic sense of self. On a practical level, when students are worried about the way that they're going to be treated based on their gender at school, it directly impacts their ability to be successful. It's hard to focus on fractions when I'm worried that people are going to make fun of me because I have pink shoelaces or I happen to be a little more interested in football than people say I should be. Those are factors which affect not only transgender students, of course, but any child who's perceived to be transgressing the norms and expectations of gender. And so this work really is about creating an atmosphere in which every child is safe to express gender the way they wish, to enjoy the activities, to pursue the interests, to wear the clothes that make them feel comfortable. And so in this dealing with this issue, we not only create a safer space for transgender students, we also create a space in which every child's gender identity can be accepted and celebrated.
Thanks, Joel. I can add to this briefly as well. The other aspect of this that we know that Joel has referenced is that students are watching how educators respond to or don't respond to any sort of comments that are derogatory or any bullying that goes on in the classroom around any sort of difference. And so what's happening in the classroom is that students with all of their differences are watching to see if, for example, the comment that was made about gender is addressed or not addressed, to assess if they're going to be safe in the classroom when it may come around to a time when they are being picked on for the difference that they bring. And the bottom line is that we know that this has not only an impact on how a student feels about themselves, but it also has an impact in the case of talking about schools on their ability to learn. And there's so much research out there now that shows the correlation between a student's sense of safety and their ability to achieve at school. And so we want to, and the guide stresses this, that we want to address that doing this work and addressing all comments made about differences and all types of identity-based bullying that goes on is about keeping all students safe at school.
So I'd like to move on to the next question, which came from Kathy. If a family is not affirming or supportive regarding a child's identity, what and how should the school proceed to ensure and protect the child's educational environment? That is a great question, one that we get from many schools, because unfortunately transgender and gender expansive kids do experience a lot of family rejection, whether it's one parent or both parents. And I think the place that we start from is, as educators, what you do is create an environment for transgender students and gender expansive kids to learn, for all kids really, but since we're talking about those groups, we'll focus on those today. And so it's really about meeting with the student and figuring out what you can do as a school to support them. It may be, referring to them by nickname as opposed to their birth name. It may be allowing them to use the correct restroom and locker room. But I think it's important in those discussions to sort of think through what are the things that could happen. So what if, their best friend goes home and, sees their parents and says, oh, by the way, did you know that so-and-so is now using X restroom? And so to really prepare and think through potential issues, the purpose of the conversation is not to convince them to withdraw their request to use the restroom, just to help them think through some of the possibilities that could happen. In addition to the things that you can do on campus, I think it's also important to think through For example, what happens when you do talk to people outside? If you do talk to the family, are there people that you can't use the nickname with, or are there people that you can? What about siblings? Really sort of think through all those variables. Again, it may make it more difficult or more complex to figure out how to support the student, but even just knowing that you're willing to can go a long distance. But I think in addition to sort of their day-to-day life, we absolutely encourage schools to meet with the family to see if they can bring them on board. Because what's going to be most important for them in the long term, all the statistics that Joel cited about not having a supportive school are even more important when you don't have a supportive home. The studies show that the most determinative factor of a young person's short and long-term mental health and well-being is the level of family acceptance or rejection at home. And so to the extent that schools can create a safe environment for the student to come out to their parents or provide resources to the family to understand what gender identity is, and that what the parents are doing to them may seem as they're trying to protect their child from bullying, discrimination, really is interpreted by their child as rejection, and how harmful that can be. Many families don't understand that, and so educating them can be hugely helpful. And I think there's unfortunately going to be situations where you can't bring both parents on board. There may already just be a conflict between the parents about whether or not to affirm their child's gender identity. And I think, again, in those situations, it's really important to support the child. And one thing that educators can really do in those situations is if there's an ongoing custody dispute, they can be a really great resource for the young person to come in and testify and talk about what the students like at school, the things that they're saying, and really support the student in doing what's best for them. Because I think judges will see the educator as a neutral party, someone who doesn't have any interest other than the student, whereas parents sort of are seen as biased because they love their children and they want what they want. And so I think if you look, we talk about this extensively in Chapter 5 of the guide. So I would encourage you to consult that chapter in particular. But those are some of the main issues that come up.
And I just really want to emphasize a couple things Asaf said there, in particular this notion of how critical it is for schools to meet parents where they are. One of the important things we do at Gender Spectrum is recognize that it's often a very challenging situation for families encountering a student grappling with their gender. It can bring up any number of issues, including some of the safety concerns Asaf mentioned, concerns about their own standing, the family's own standing in their community, the judgments that might be made about them, etc. And I think one of the important words we use when we're working with youth around affirming or non-affirming parents is the word yet. Often students will say, well, my family isn't on board, they'll never be on board. And what we like to talk about is, well, they're not there yet, but let's talk about what it might look like to move them, if not from absolute affirmation, towards a less rejecting stance, because that less rejecting stance, again, has a tremendous impact on the student's health and well-being, the way that is experienced at home. Asaf, I think one of the questions I know we get a lot, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, is this notion of when a school feels that even though the child has requested that privacy be maintained, and please don't tell my parents that I am dressing in a way that's not consistent with the way I leave in the morning, for instance, what are schools to do when either A, their parent of that child says, I want to know what's going on here, or B, that if it's in the school official's opinion or a staff member's opinion, that they think it's just in the kid's best interest for those parents to know. Do you have any thoughts on either one of those circumstances?
Yeah, I think those are really interesting circumstances. When a student comes to school with regards to dress, I think parents often do feel like they have a right to know, but actually students do have quite a bit of privacy rights. And so I think as an administrator on that side of it, you'll really want to gauge how safe that is. And again, then sort of talk to the students, say, hey, look, your parent is asking, for a report back on how you're dressing every day. Let's talk about keeping you safe, and what that looks like. We would encourage an administrator to, particularly in that point, it sounds like there might be some sort of back and forth between some disagreement between the student and their parent about this, and that may be a ripe time to bring in the family and start explaining to them, what they do at school, why it's important why they allow all students to express themselves however they feel, because it creates an environment where all students can learn, and the importance of doing that and sort of doing that education process. That scenario indicates to me that there is a high level of conflict. So to the extent that you can hook the family up with mental health providers who are going to be affirming, I think that's also something that's really helpful. As far as other school personnel, for example, feeling like it's important for, it's in the student's best interest. Again, I think we really have to trust the individual student to know how their home life is going to be. I think, obviously, we would hope that the school will work with that young person to create an environment where they feel comfortable disclosing if that's what they want. But we really have to trust the student that they know what's going on at home, and to help them sort of maintain their safety while also, when they come to school, feeling safe at school and feeling like they can learn.
Thanks, Asaf. I see there's a couple other questions here that I believe actually are related. The first is about how do we share with friends of my child who has already transitioned about the importance of using proper pronouns and why those pronouns are changing. And then the second question asked about, since many parents and staff are certain that there are only XX females and XY males, in other words, that gender is inexorably linked to biology and that there are only two kinds of bodies, when is it appropriate to begin introducing that in fact is simply not accurate? And to me, these both speak to the importance of a proactive gender-inclusive approach in general to the work we do at schools. In other words, oftentimes when Gender Spectrum gets a call from a school asking for support around the needs of a particular transgender student, I often find myself saying, boy, I wish you had a time machine. Because one of the ways we create the most positive experiences for a transgender child is to have already created a foundation or framework that recognizes the diversity of gender that exists for all young people. And that's why it's important that before a transgender student ever shows up on campus, there begins to be some language that recognizes gender as not a simple binary notion. When we talk about bodies and physiology, it's important to point out that while most bodies come in a typically male or female form, they don't all come in that form. Naturally occurring variations are part of the biological continuum of life. And that is an important beginning, because suddenly this idea of, well, there are only certain kinds of bodies, boy bodies and girl bodies, that's just not accurate. And I think it's important, as we try to move people from binary thinking about gender to more spectrum-based models, that they recognize that that's true both not only physically, but also in terms of gender expression and gender identity. It's in the context of talking about gender as a form of diversity that we then can begin introducing things like, so some people have different kinds of pronouns that they use. Some people have the ability to understand themselves as neither male nor female. And that doesn't mean someone who is traditionally male or female, or of course a term we use, that it's okay if that's your experience, and it's okay if it's not. What we often find ourselves doing when it comes to supporting transgender kids at school is doing it from a very reactionary place in which we're scrambling. And what we believe, and the foundation of this document, and certainly our organization, is that gender impacts every child. And by creating a schema for understanding the diversity of gender initially, we then are prepared for not only the experience of the transgender student who we encounter, which is far less frequent than the student whose gender expression is perceived to be atypical in some way. A boy who's perceived to not be quite as masculine as maybe the other boys or community think he should be. A girl who's perceived not to be feminine enough. In most of those cases, as educators, we all know dozens and dozens of those kids who get targeted for those characteristics. And in creating a gender-inclusive space, we're actually meeting their needs and anticipating the needs of that transgender student who we may also encounter.
And also, thank you, Joel. And to follow up on that, I think with regards to the pronouns question, I think it's also really important, you know, whenever you're approaching a school, for example, if you're a parent, to really sort of focus on stories, right? And think about how your child would respond or react if they were in a school environment where, you know, even if their name isn't changing because it's a gender-neutral name, that they're being referred to with the wrong pronouns. How is that going to affect their ability to sort of sit in class, pay attention in class, you know, interact with their peers? And so think about those things, and that'll really help guide, you know, who you want to tell, what they need to know, and also how you sort of get an educator or administrator to understand. Because for many administrators and educators, it may be the first time they've heard it. And it's not that they're not sensitive; they just haven't worked on this issue before. And so telling those stories really helps them understand that, you know, that using the correct name or correct pronoun, or allowing a transgender student to use the right restroom is not some minor thing. It's actually quite a major thing, that their gender identity be affirmed in all aspects of the school environment. So I would sort of encourage you to think about how your child would react if they were mispronounced throughout the day, and then sort of use that as a gauge for how to, who should know and how to go about telling them.
Great, thanks, Justin. I see we have another question. I know a student who is open with their gender identity at school but is not their authentic self at home. Can you share why it's so critical to respect that? And I think this comes back to Asaf's assertion that these young people are tremendously aware of what the market can bear, so to speak. They are very mindful of what the adults in their lives can handle. And also the potential consequences of their authentic self and their assertion of their authentic self, the reaction that might receive at home. And so we need to be very, very thoughtful about that, because the fact of the matter is that child may very well know that if their parents learn that they are using a different name or pronoun at school, that they are using the restroom consistent with their identity, they not only will be in trouble, they may be asked to leave, are severe. And when a young person explains that to us, we need to listen loud and clear. At the same time, we also have to work with that young person. I believe we also need to help them understand that that's great, but we're not in absolute control about that. Right? So if you're going to school and you're using a different pronoun or a different name, and your neighbor also sends their child to school and their child mentions at home, oh, it's really interesting, you know, Joel is using Jenny at school. Everyone's calling Joel Jenny at school. Isn't that awesome? Well, that child's parents may think it's awesome or may not, but they may share that with Joel's parents or Jenny's parents. And therefore, we need to help that child desire, and we'll operate under those conditions. What are the contingencies in place? What do you do if you come home and you're confronted by your parents and are suddenly told, you need to leave home now, so get out and pack your bags? As educators, I believe we have a responsibility to have helped that child be prepared for that and give them an adult they can turn to say, so what happened? I've been asked to leave, or what they're supposed to do if they're feeling physically endangered. I'll just follow up with the next question. It says, I assume we're welcome to use this document when we are working with schools. 1,000 times yes. The purpose of this document and why it is available at all of our websites is that we want this document out in the field, being used, being dog-eared, and quite frankly, being recreated as it's used. We all know this is a very new area of work, and while, you know, some of us have more experience than others, There's a lot of great practices out there that we're discovering every day. And the only request I would make on behalf of the organizations that were involved in its creation is please share with us what is working, what's not working, how you ran into trouble using a particular document or tool, or how you discovered a great response to a concern being raised in the community. And it's in that process that we will continue to tune this document and more effectively meet the needs of both students. To that end, one thing Gender Spectrum has created is something called our Gender Spectrum Lounge, which is an online community, and it includes a lounge specifically for educators. And our hope is that that community, that online community, will become a source of ongoing discourse about the use of this guide and ways in which to further improve it.
Can I jump in and add a little something to Kathy's question?
Please, sure.
I just want to say, I know that a school in Kansas used this in professional development for teachers just yesterday, because I heard from a friend of a friend who'd shared it off of my Facebook page. We are thrilled if people are using it with teachers and with schools, and since it came out, what was it, last Monday before last, I have sent this to parents in Tennessee, Texas, Indiana, Ohio, 3 or 4 other states that I'm completely blanking on right now. But we've heard from a lot of folks who are finding it pretty useful. And share it. We'd love for you to share it far and wide.
And also to sort of jump off that as well and then address the next question, I think, really what the Schools in Transition Guide was about practical tips for your day-to-day work as an educator or as a parent. What should it look like if a school is supporting your child, your transgender or gender expansive child? One of the things that, a lot of folks already know, what our organizations say about, yes, you should support a transgender kid, which means they should get access to the restrooms and locker rooms, and you should respect their name and pronoun and all those things. But we wanted to do a deeper dive with this document and really provide the nitty-gritty, like what does that look like on a day-to-day basis, and really give everyone involved the tools to really make that happen. And that's that's the reason for the length of the document and sort of the detail of it, because we didn't want to just do the platitudes that we've all been saying for a while now. We wanted to really give those tools to folks and also create sort of common ground so parents and educators all have the same information and can really collaborate together to support transgender students in their schools. So I'd like to move to the next question, which is, our school district's current policy is that there is no policy and they address each student on a case-by-case basis, which means each school varies. How do we go about getting the school district to adopt a solid policy? That's a really great question. It's really going to depend in large part on the sort of dynamics of your local school, but here are some suggestions. I think one of the things that we often find is that school administrators are really craving this guidance. They don't know, they want to support their students, they know that they should be, but they just don't know how. And so encouraging a school district to adopt these guidance or a policy will help clarify that for the school administrators, and so there's consistency. And I think beyond that, I think we can't ignore the reality that if there are sort of different treatment among schools within a district, that's sort of really ripe for a legal challenge, because you're going to get some schools that are super supportive and doing everything they need to support their transgender students and creating a gender-inclusive school environment, and then the school down the street is going to be doing the exact opposite, and it's going to really ultimately, unfortunately, harm students, but going to be a really clear demonstration as to why any objection the school board might have to adopting a policy really can't withstand any kind of scrutiny at all. Often school boards are concerned about, how the community might react, or all the what ifs, for example, that we talk about with regards to bathrooms. And if there's a school, one school in the district that's doing it and not having any problems, there's really no reason why the school, the other schools in that district can't do the same. So I think, both look, as educators, you should be doing it, and educators need and want this guidance, and also, sort of a let's cover our butts and not get sued, and really support our students at the same time, I think are really your best reasons for encouraging a school district to adopt a policy.
I'd like to add to this as well. I don't know if the person who asked the question is an educator asking it from within the school, or if it's a parent or community member outside of the school system, but schools tend to have a cycle or a process that they follow in getting new policies adopted. And so, one way to get things going is to just, in general, ask a question about how policies do get adopted, or how do we introduce a new policy in the school, or what committee do I need to serve on or be on. I've seen it happen in a number of different ways. Oftentimes school districts will have an equity and diversity committee that or a group that's working on anti-bullying in the school district. And so there's a lot of different ways that new policies get introduced in schools, and sometimes it comes from the educators, sometimes it comes from parents, sometimes it comes from administrators, sometimes it comes from all of those groups working together saying, hey, we have this gap in our school district and we want to be able to start this process. And you can ask the superintendent, or you can ask your principal how that can happen. And then also, I think that schools, really like to see what other school districts are doing. There are a lot of model policies out there. I'm pretty sure that all of our organizations have examples of model policies, so you don't have to begin at the beginning, ground zero. You can take a look at other policies and bring them into your schools and school districts and say, here's what this school is doing. I'm wondering if we can make something like this happen in our school district. I just have to say, I'm amazed that over the years sometimes we can have this idea that the school doesn't want it, and it's just that sometimes the question hasn't been asked, can we have it, and then how can we have it, like what's the process, and then things can move forward. So I'd encourage you to ask about it in your school district, about how policies can be implemented, and see if you can get it moved forward.
And thank you, Joanna. That was really great. And also, just to add to that, in terms of policies that are out there, I do want to sort of point out, and we talk about this in the Schools in Transition Guide, but the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights recently approved the transgender non-discrimination policy developed by the Arcadia Unified School District, which they were required to develop in response to a complaint by a transgender student that the school had violated Title IX by discriminating against that student. It's a really great policy, and I think to the extent you want to try and get your district to adopt a policy, the fact that it has the sort of blessing of the federal government as sort of complying with Title IX, I think certainly would be helpful, and I do think it is a really solid policy and clear, and provides that guidance that I think school administrators are looking for.
I see we don't actually have any other questions at this point, and so I do want to make sure I raise one other subject, which is the concern about the assertion of the rights and needs of transgender students as somehow being the imposition of a set of values and beliefs on a community that may not share, or at least universally share, those understandings. And one of the things we always like to emphasize is that this is not about every single person becoming a champion for transgender rights. This is not the expectation that families reject the values they're teaching their children at home, regardless of what they are. What these notions are about, however, is A, the right for children to be safe and protected at school, and the right for every young person to be treated with kindness and respect. I think we all learned when we were quite young that if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. And this is not about saying that people have to change their values and beliefs in terms of their notions of ideas about gender and their ideas about what they're teaching their children at home. except for the fact that they must teach their children that every child has a right to be safe and supported at school. And secondly, we often hear people raise the question of, well, but my child doesn't feel safe when they're told that there's lots of ways to be a boy or a girl. And one of the things the guide emphasizes is the importance of distinguishing being uncomfortable with being unsafe. In other words, what we're saying is that, yes, it might be new for many people in the community to be grappling with some of these questions about gender diversity and the needs of transgender students. That discomfort is not the same as the lack of safety that those very students face in unsupportive school environments. Living in a democracy throughout our history, we have grappled with various issues that made some aspects of the community uncomfortable. That does not mean we do not respond to those needs. We address those lacks of comfort. We try to accommodate those needs as best as possible, but not at the expense of the group that has been targeted and is, in fact, actually unsafe.
So the next question is from Diego about, does this guide apply at all to students or families who deal with public colleges or universities? And I think, this guide was really geared towards the K-12 context, but a lot of what we talk about, the principles we talk about, and the approaches that we talk about can be applied in the college setting as well. The colleges and universities, anyone that receives federal funding is aligned much like public schools are K through 12. And I think a lot of what we talk about, again, can be applied, for example, respecting a student's chosen name and gender and pronouns, respecting their ability to access the facilities that are consistent with their gender identity, housing, all those kinds of things. A lot of the concerns that come up, for example, on overnight field trips are the same ones that come up with regards to overnight housing. So I think this can be used and can be adapted. But it's not necessarily geared towards students at that age.
The next question from Bradley. In addition to reading this awesome document, do you have any advice for working with families and youth that are just starting their gender journey? There's a lot of great info out there online. Actually, I have like a little set email of links that I usually send to parents that I end up speaking with who are kind of at that point with working with their children. There are lots of, Gender Spectrum has a lot of great stuff on their website. Local PFLAG chapters don't always have a ton of experience working with trans kids, but they're lovely, supportive people and often a really great resource for parents. There are a few different conferences for families with trans children that happen around the country, and from what I've heard from families who have been to those, they're tremendously affirming and just great experiences. There's a summer camp for trans and gender expansive kids I think it's in California and New England. There's a lot of stuff out there if you just start kind of Googling around. But there are Facebook groups. There's a lot of stuff out there that you should be able to find some support, and probably the nearest metropolitan area is going to have some sort of support as well.
Great. Hello again. This is Justin. I just, as we are wrapping up now, that's 12:30. I want to take a minute to kind of thank everyone for being a part of today. I'm going to share something on my screen really quick, which is the Students in Transition guide. These are all of the authors and the folks who took part in helping to create this document. So please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions, comments, or if you have positive feedback as well, because we also love getting positive feedback. If you click on the Showcase button, you can also download the document if you haven't done that already. And then also take a look at all the websites for the organizations that our speakers are a part of. Gender Spectrum has a great back-to-school document that is currently available as well. So thank you to Asaf, Chris, Joel, and Joanna for taking the time to chat with us today. This video will be published on the Gender Spectrum YouTube page, so when it is, please feel free to share it with anyone that you think may find it helpful. Finally, and this is very important and I don't think can be overlooked, I want to thank everyone who is viewing this and participated in the Q&A. We received a lot of great and thoughtful questions from folks. Each of you is clearly, obviously dedicated to supporting the incredible youth that you work with or are part of your family. So I think I speak for all 5 of us and the organizations that we work for and are supportive that we're so grateful for the positive impact you are having on the lives of young people, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So thank you, everyone. So we are going to be stopping the broadcast now. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and week. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.